So we're given that BC bisects angle ABD. So that's this angle right here. Okay, so if it bisects that angle, I know that these two angles are going to be congruent. So I'll remember to talk about that. And A is congruent to D. And I'm trying to prove that AC is congruent to DC. So this is where I'm trying to go here. So in order to get those two sides congruent, I'm going to try and get these two triangles congruent, because then I can say their corresponding parts must then also be congruent. So when I look at this image, I have angle, angle, and I also have this shared side by reflexive property. So I can get these two triangles congruent by angle, angle, side. Then, like I said, I can get these sides that I've highlighted in green congruent because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So first we're going to write out our givens. Okay, we know that BC bisected this angle. So let's talk about how I know angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. I know that because of that angle bisector. An angle bisector divides an angle into two congruent angles. Okay, they gave me A and D, so I've got angle, angle. I still have to talk about this shared side. So BC is congruent to BC, and that's by reflexive. Okay, now I can say the triangles are congruent because I got that side. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DBC. Oops. Now that I have the triangles congruent, I can say that AC must then be congruent to DC. And that's because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Alright, so XZ bisects angle YXW, excuse me. So these two angles will be congruent. XY is perpendicular to YZ, so this is going to be 90. And XW is perpendicular to WZ, so I'll also mark that. So that'll end up being 90 degrees. And I want to prove that YZ is congruent to WZ. Okay, so just like the previous problem, I'm going to prove that these two triangles are congruent, and it looks like I have a shared side. Now, I have to talk about why 1 and 2 are congruent. That'll be the first angle. I'm going to talk about why these right angles are congruent. That'll be the second angle. And then I've got the shared side here by reflexive. So I'll be doing angle, angle, side. Okay, so write our givens. Okay, first let's talk about the angle bisector. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And I know this because an angle bisector divides an angle into two congruent angles. Let's talk about the shared side. XZ is congruent to itself by reflexive. All right, now this is going to take a little bit of work. I know that angle Y and angle W are right angles, and that's because of those two givens, right? They told me that those lines were perpendicular. Perpendicular lines create right angles. And if they're both right angles, well then they're both congruent to each other. So angle Y is congruent to angle W, and that's because all right angles are congruent. So you got to make sure that you're doing this as two steps. You can't just jump in and say Y and W are congruent. You have to say first that they're right angles because of the perpendicularity, then talk about why all right angles are congruent. Okay, so then I've got the angle here in my proof. I talked about the other angle, and I have the side of my proof. So I have angle, angle, side. It's all in my proof. So now I can say that triangle XYZ is congruent to triangle XWZ by angle, angle, side. So then all I have to say is YZ is congruent to WZ because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent.